The vaccines work, and they work really, really well. It's just important to remember, I hear a lot of people say, well, if I can still get COVID, why would I get the vaccine? Because our goal is to keep you out of the hospital and keep you from dying. This is our St. Bernard's data. This is a snapshot from October the 1st. We had 57 total COVID patients. 88% of them were unvaccinated. But look at our ICU patients. 89% of COVID ICU patients were unvaccinated, and 90% of patients on the ventilator from COVID were unvaccinated. 98% of the deaths that we've had from COVID since June were in unvaccinated individuals. They looked at the states in the country that had the lowest vaccination rates, the 10 states in the country, which Arkansas is one, unfortunately, and found that if you live in one of those states, your risk of dying from COVID is 4 times higher than if you live in one of the top 10 vaccinated states in the country.
Welcome to the Rotary Club of Jonesboro, 5-time reigning Club of the Year. Our inspirational moment: keep your face always towards the sunshine and shadows will fall behind you. That's Walt Whitman. And now, Leanne, will you please come up and introduce our program, please?
So it has been a while, and I apologize for that, but I have been busy doing that along with Kasey. She's been doing all the clinical work in our office. So she is the Vice President of Medical Affairs and our Medical Director of Quality and Safety at St. Bernard's Medical Center. She has, like I said, been spending the last 19 months completely immersed in the latest therapies, approaches, preventions of COVID-19. Dr. Holder is a hospitalist by trade and has called Arkansas her home all her life. In fact, she's a Northeast Arkansas native. She joined St. Bernard's nearly a decade ago to help start the adult and pediatric hospitalist program. 6 years ago, she moved to the administrative role as Vice President of Medical Affairs. She went to medical school at UAMS, and she and her husband, Jeremy, have 2 children. Please help me to welcome Dr. Kasey Holder.
Thank y'all. All right, so I almost messed that whole thing up. So I knew Leanne was asked to come and introduce me. I had no idea why. And so yesterday I saw her in our administrative office, and I was like, if you're busy tomorrow, don't worry about it. I can introduce myself. You don't have to come. And so she wasn't going to come. And then at 8 o'clock last night, I get the message like, we are trying to give her an award. Oops. So anyway, I'm glad that worked out. All right. Well, so thank you guys so much for having me today to talk about vaccines. So there's a whole lot of information out there, and it's really hard to know what's factual and what's not factual. There's a whole lot of misinformation and confusion. So what I'm going to talk about today is just facts. It's not opinions. There's no Facebook post, blog post. This is just real data. So maybe for you, if you're not vaccinated yet and you're trying to decide, this can help you. Or if you are and you have a friend or a family member or coworker or whatever, this information maybe can help you in those conversations to be able to answer a lot of the questions that people have. So I structured the talk around a lot of the concerns that I do hear from people and questions that I have heard from people. So I try to answer those throughout the talk, but certainly if at any point you have a question, please just raise your hand. It can be very informal. And if I don't cover something at the end, I'll be happy to answer any questions. So the first thing I hear a whole lot is that people are worried because the vaccine was developed so quickly. And so they feel like it's not safe because it was developed so quickly. And so to be able to address that concern, you really sort of have to understand what normally happens when we make vaccines. So this is the typical timeline for vaccine development. And you can see, if you can see those numbers up top, it's typically 10 to 15 years to make a vaccine. And there's a whole lot of bureaucracy and red tape and things that we were able to sort of cut through. Obviously, in the pandemic, we needed to move faster than 10 to 15 years. And so this is what we actually did. We condensed that process down to about 1 year. And I want to make a couple of points here. And I don't know if you guys can see the words on here, but that bottom star highlights there's a 5 to 6 year time period that's typically spent building factories, manufacturing the vaccine, and then distributing. Well, we moved that back and started that at the same time that we started the clinical trials. And we typically don't do that because when you start a clinical trial, you don't know for sure if what you're trialing is going to work. And so that's a big investment to do that. But of course, we had some government assistance. We had lots of businesses willing to collaborate. And so we were able to do that. So that took 5 to 6 years off right there. And it had nothing to do with determining the quality or the safety of the vaccine. The second star there at the top highlights there's typically many years spent in lab research and preclinical research on animals. And so it looks like we didn't do that stuff, but in reality, we did. So if you'll all remember SARS, which came on the scene back in 2002, that was by another coronavirus, just like the SARS-CoV-2 or COVID. It was SARS-CoV-1. So research actually started in 2002 to try to develop a vaccine against SARS-CoV-1. And again, not the exact same virus as COVID, but very, very similar. They're sort of like cousins. And so we were able to take that research, 18 years worth of research, and very quickly identify a target that we could use for the vaccine against SARS-CoV-2. So we definitely had lots of research. The other concern I hear is this messenger RNA technology, which is the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. That's new to the public. We haven't had vaccines using messenger RNA technology before, but that doesn't mean we don't know about it or we haven't been trialing it. So really, if you look back, the very first phase 1 and 2 clinical trial using messenger RNA vaccines was in 2008. So we had 12 years worth of data using clinical trials, so trials on humans of messenger RNA vaccine technology. That bottom graph there, again, you probably can't see the years, but starting in 2009, those bars and the different colors represent trials that took place in the field of oncology or cancer treatment that used messenger RNA vaccines. So messenger RNA technology has a lot of promise in the treatment of cancers in the form of a vaccine. So we have a lot of data actually on messenger RNA technology and use in humans. So real quickly, I just wanted to go through what is messenger RNA. And this is stuff, believe it or not, we all learned at some point. Actually, my son built a DNA model over the weekend. That was a lot of fun out of beads and floral wire. And my daughter is learning about DNA and messenger RNA too. She's in 5th grade. So this is all stuff we learned, but it's not stuff we all think about on a daily basis. So a quick refresher. Messenger RNA is basically a copy of a piece of your DNA. So it's sort of a blueprint or an instruction manual for your body. And it sort of codes or tells your body how to make proteins. And then we use proteins as sort of the building blocks of all of our systems. So for this vaccine specifically, the messenger RNA piece codes for the spike protein. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but if you'll see that top right-hand picture, those blue things sticking out, that's a picture of the virus particle. Those are spike proteins. And so this messenger RNA in this vaccine codes for that spike protein. Now, one of the things I hear people say a lot, when you talk about messenger RNA, people think about DNA, and they worry about, can this vaccine somehow alter my DNA? Can it incorporate itself into my DNA? It cannot, okay? And there's a couple of reasons for that, but I love this analogy. I stole it from a friend of mine. If you have a cookbook with all your favorite recipes in it, and you think of that as your DNA, okay? And then if you take one of those recipes and you write it out on a recipe card, that's like messenger RNA. That's your instructions or your blueprint for how to build your protein, which is in this picture, it's your chicken noodle soup, okay? But you don't do that in reverse, right? You don't go backwards in that way. This process doesn't work backwards either. Messenger RNA never enters into the nucleus of your cell, which is where your DNA lives. It never even goes in the same space. So it does not incorporate itself into your DNA. It cannot alter your DNA. All right. So more about how the vaccine works specifically. First, you have to understand, why was the spike protein the target that we selected? So the spike protein in this picture is red. That red arrow up there is how the virus makes its way into your cells. So it's how it is able to enter our bodies and cause infection. The way it does that is through a receptor called an ACE2 receptor. And we have ACE2 receptors on cells all throughout our body. Matter of fact, this picture over on the left shows you everywhere in your body that the cells have ACE2 receptors. And it's pretty much everywhere. Excuse me. So it sort of makes COVID make sense, how some people can have nausea and vomiting, some people get pneumonia, some people just get a headache and body aches. It can impact people very differently. But basically, these ACE2 receptors open up your entire body to the virus. And that's why it can get in and cause just really overwhelming infection and make people really sick really fast. So what the vaccine does is, in a lab, a piece of that messenger RNA that codes for a spike protein was created. And it was wrapped in a fatty bubble, or a lipid nanoparticle is the fancy term, but it's basically a fatty bubble. And that's how the mRNA is basically protected, so that it can survive until it gets into your cells. So that's what's in the vaccine. That's injected into your arm. It stays right in that muscle. It's gone within about 36 hours. It doesn't go anywhere else in your body, just right in your arm. That fatty bubble is taken up by your cells, and then the messenger RNA does exactly what it's supposed to do. Your body codes it. We make spike proteins, and then our immune system recognizes those spike proteins as foreign and says, we got to get rid of this, and we form antibodies. So the next time we are exposed to a spike protein, usually when it has a virus attached to it, we already have a response ready to go. It sounds the alarms, our antibodies react, attack the virus, and end of story. So that's how the vaccine works. Any questions on any of that? No? Yes, ma'am. No, there were actually two specific myths on that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, that have since been debunked, that brought up the fertility concern. Yes, sir.
Is that on the fact that it goes to different parts of the fact that some people have all symptoms one way?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, I'm sorry. So the question is that, the first question was the fact that these receptors and the virus has access to all these areas in our body potentially related to the infertility concern. And it's not. There's a couple of specific myths that came early on that have since been debunked. Second question is the fact that all these ACE2 receptors are all over our body, and that's what accounts for, excuse me, the variation of symptoms that people can have. Yes. But yeah, people, and some people don't have any symptoms. Some people just have a headache. It's just, it depends on where the virus entered into your body. Okay. So I'm going to talk quickly, or not quickly, but what's left is about how do we know the vaccine works and how do we know it's safe? So when we are trialing vaccines and we're trying to determine that they're safe, there's two things that we look at. The first thing is we want the vaccine to prevent infection. So we want to look at vaccine efficacy at preventing infection. But the second thing, which is actually the most important thing, the biggest goal, is we want the vaccine to prevent severe illness and death. So you all know this. There's not a vaccine out there that is 100% effective at preventing infection. You can get the flu vaccine and still get flu. You can get the shingles vaccine and still get shingles. So that's a goal, but that's not the goal. The goal is if you get the flu after you've had a flu vaccine, we don't want you to get really sick and end up in the hospital and die. So those are the two things we look at when we're trying to decide if a vaccine works or not. This is actually the original clinical trial data. So the blue line represents people who did not get the vaccine. The red line represents people that did. And they had these two groups of people, like 40,000 people. They released them back into the wild, and then they just watched to see who got COVID. Every square on that blue line and every circle on the red line represents a COVID infection. And the darker squares and circles represent severe illness or death. So what you can see pretty clearly there is the unvaccinated group just kept getting COVID infections, and the vaccinated group did not. Their rate of infection slowed dramatically, but not to zero. But the rate of protection from severe illness and death was very, very good. This is where that original 95% vaccine efficacy data came from, okay, was this data. Now, a lot has changed, obviously, in the past few months. We've got the Delta variant, which is more infectious. It causes more severe illness. We know now that immunity wanes over time with the vaccine. We're learning more about how our natural immunity wanes. And so we've seen over the past few months an increase in breakthrough infections, or the same way to say that is a decrease in vaccine efficacy at preventing infection. So instead of 95%, it's more along the lines of 80 to 85% now. And that's specific to the messenger RNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. So more people that have been vaccinated are now getting a COVID infection. The great news is it remains over 92% effective at preventing severe illness and death. So it has not lost that efficacy. The vaccine still will keep you from getting really sick and dying, or at least reduce your risk significantly if you're vaccinated. Now, this is some more recent data. So this is from January to July of this year. And what they did was they looked at every resident in the state of Kentucky that had to be hospitalized due to COVID, and then they looked at their vaccination status, if they were vaccinated or unvaccinated. The blue line is unvaccinated, yellow line is vaccinated. Clearly a big discrepancy there. You are far less likely to end up in the hospital if you're vaccinated than if you're unvaccinated. But the other important information that came from this study is they looked at those group of people that were vaccinated and ended up in the hospital and said, well, why? They were vaccinated. Why did they still end up in the hospital and really sick from COVID? And what they found was they had certain characteristics. So they were typically older. They had a median age of 73, and they had chronic medical conditions, typically 3 or more, or they lived in a long-term care facility like a nursing home. And that's the data that they used to make those booster recommendations that came out just a couple of weeks ago. So if you're vaccinated, if you're older, if you have chronic medical conditions, you're still going to have a higher risk of being in the hospital or not doing well from COVID. Even more recent than that, so this is April through July, and the importance of that is this data is when the Delta variant was the predominant variant. So it's basically looking at how well does the vaccine work against the Delta variant. And it showed that if you're vaccinated, your risk of infection is 5 times lower than if you're unvaccinated, and your risk of being in the hospital or dying is more than 10 times lower. So the vaccine is still very effective, even with the Delta variant. This is data I pulled from the Department of Health just yesterday, that they look at all of our active cases, our hospitalizations, and our deaths, and whether or not you're vaccinated or unvaccinated. And you can see our active cases, 82% or almost 83% unvaccinated. But look at our hospitalizations and deaths. Almost 90% of hospitalizations are unvaccinated. 87% of deaths are unvaccinated. And this headline at the bottom was some data that came out a few weeks ago where they looked at the states in the country that had the lowest vaccination rates, the 10 states in the country, which Arkansas is one, unfortunately, and found that if you live in one of those states, your risk of dying from COVID is 4 times higher than if you live in one of the top 10 vaccinated states in the country. And your risk of having to be in the hospital from COVID is 3 times higher. And then this is as close as home as I can get. This is our St. Bernard's data. This is a snapshot from October the 1st. We had 57 total COVID patients. 88% of them were unvaccinated. But look at our ICU patients. 89% of COVID ICU patients were unvaccinated, and 90% of patients on the ventilator from COVID were unvaccinated. 98% of the deaths that we've had from COVID since June were in unvaccinated individuals. So the vaccines work, and they work really, really well. It's just important to remember I hear a lot of people say, well, if I can still get COVID, why would I get the vaccine? Because our goal is to keep you out of the hospital and keep you from dying. All right. So how do we know the vaccine is safe? So when we're looking at safety, we look at short-term data and we look at long-term data. So our short-term data comes from those clinical trials. So you have phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, and those are trials in humans. You start initially with a small group, 20 to 300 healthy volunteers. You're just trying to make sure there's nothing crazy going to happen, that these vaccines are safe. You're not going to have any unexpected adverse events. And that's the goal of phase 1. Phase 2, you get bigger groups, several hundred people. You're continued looking at safety, but also now starting to look at efficacy. You want to know what dose you can use to minimize side effects and get the biggest bang for your buck. And then you move on to phase 3, which is hundreds or thousands of volunteers, more safety information, but this is where you start to compare people who had the vaccine to people who didn't, and really nailing down how well the vaccine works. So all this data then is taken to the FDA, and that's what they look at for approval. Now, typically they have months to years worth of information from clinical trials. But if you'll remember in the beginning, we sort of shortened all of that. And so when this data went to the FDA, they had 2 months worth of data. And they said, we want at least 2 months worth of data. And that's important because when you look at the history of vaccine development, adverse events that occur after a vaccine historically have occurred within the first 2 months. So they knew that, and they knew if something is going to happen commonly and it's going to be bad, we're going to know about it by looking at 2 months worth of data. So that's what they use to give the emergency use authorization. But even after we approve a vaccine and we manufacture it and we distribute it and we're giving it, we keep looking at data for years. So we get this long-term data. And that comes through several areas, but mostly reporting systems. So that VAERS, which is Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, is a national data bank, and anybody can report to it. And the important thing to remember, and I'll highlight this in a minute, is healthcare facilities and healthcare providers are required to report certain things to VAERS, whether they think it's related to the vaccine or not. Because what happens is all of those reports that go in that system are evaluated by a team of medical experts, researchers, scientists. They get information from doctors' records to autopsy results to try to determine, is this a trend? Are we seeing this a lot? And can we tie it back to the vaccine? And so then they determine if those reported events are actually confirmed to be associated with the vaccine. So we have a lot of that data now, 10 months into giving vaccines. We have a whole lot of data from those reporting systems. The trade-off here, and this is a highlight, is there are some adverse events that occur so rarely that you have to have hundreds of thousands or millions of people that have received the vaccine before we recognize, hey, this is a potential that can happen. The trade-off there is, it's a very rare side effect, and we already know the vaccine works. So you've got this risk-benefit ratio that your benefit of the vaccine outweighs that very rare risk. And we've seen this with the COVID vaccine. We've seen this come to fruition. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So this is the original clinical trial safety data. You can see on the left, the vast majority of side effects that people reported were more sort of tolerability issues. The things, if you've been vaccinated, you probably experienced sore arm, headache, fatigue, maybe some nausea. These symptoms last anywhere from 12 to 24, sometimes 48 hours, but then they resolve completely. You go about your business. Most of the symptoms are mild to moderate. I got my booster a couple of Fridays ago, and I laid on the couch all day Saturday just because I didn't have anything else to do, but I could have worked if I needed to. I didn't feel great. But 6 p.m. it's gone, and I was back to normal. Okay. What we have learned through the VAERS reporting system is there is a potential association of Guillain-Barré syndrome with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine specifically. So Guillain-Barré syndrome, for anyone that doesn't know, is a syndrome where your body starts to attack the lining of your nerves. and it can cause weakness. In severe cases, it can cause paralysis. Most people fully recover, although it can take several weeks and maybe need some physical therapy to get back to normal. But with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, there have been 14.8 million doses of that vaccine given, with 210 preliminary cases. So those have been reported. They're still investigating those to see if they feel like they're associated with the vaccine or not. Typically in men over 50. And again, it occurred within that 2-month time frame. It was within 2 weeks of vaccination. It was just so rare, it occurs so rarely, that it wasn't identified in the clinical trials with only 40,000 people. The next bullet point there, the thrombosis and thrombocytopenia syndrome, or TTS for short, also, and this has been confirmed to be associated with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, is a pretty rare syndrome where your body forms clots in strange places. Not in your legs or arms that we hear about a lot, but people are forming them in their brain or in their spleen, just unusual places that can cause a lot of trouble. There have been 47 confirmed cases out of 14.8 million. Very, very rare. Women less than 50, 1 to 2 weeks after vaccination. Neither one of these are contraindications to getting the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Because they occur so rarely, the benefit of the vaccine is felt to outweigh that risk. However, if you have a concern or you have a risk that you don't want to take the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, neither one of these are associated with the messenger RNA vaccines. So you could take the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine and not have to worry about it at all. Now, specific to the messenger RNA vaccines is myocarditis and pericarditis. So that's inflammation of your heart muscle and the sac that surrounds your heart. We've given a whole lot more messenger RNA vaccines, 375 plus million doses in the country, and we've had 892 confirmed cases, typically in males, young adult males and adolescents, 12 to 19 years old, and within just a few days of vaccination. These folks have done well. Most of them have not had to be in the hospital at all. They take some steroids or anti-inflammatories. They recover within a few weeks. And an interesting study actually came out a couple of weeks ago where you look at the incidence of myocarditis from the vaccine versus the incidence of myocarditis that you can get from having a COVID infection. Your risk, it's a 10-fold higher risk that you will get myocarditis from having COVID versus from getting the vaccine. So again, it's all risk benefit, and nothing is completely without risk, but this risk is very, very low. Now, anaphylaxis, I hear people worried about allergic reactions. That can happen with any vaccine, any medicine, any food at any time. The estimated risk with the COVID vaccine is 2 to 5 per 1 million. Of course, anaphylaxis is treatable. All vaccine sites are required to have the medicines they need to treat anaphylaxis very quickly. And so that's some information for folks that are worried about allergic reactions. And then deaths. I hear a lot about the concern about deaths associated with the vaccine. This goes back to what I said about that VAERS system where healthcare facilities and healthcare providers are required to report certain things, and deaths are one of them. So if there's a death that occurs after a vaccine, we have to report it, whether we know that death was related to the cancer that patients had for 2 years or not. We even if we don't think it's associated with the vaccine, it gets reported. So there have been 8,164 reported deaths out of over 400 total million doses. So that equates to a risk of about 0.002% if all of those deaths were truly tied to the vaccine. The good news is they're not. They have started investigating these deaths. At this point, I think there have been 3 total deaths tied directly to a vaccine, and it was that TTS, that thrombosis and thrombocytopenia syndrome, that happened after the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So deaths occurring after the vaccine, really not a concern. All right, pregnancy and infertility. There's a whole lot of concern about this. So first, we have animal studies that show no safety concerns, and that's where we start with all medicines and all vaccines as we look at impact in animals. That's not always translatable to humans, but a lot of the time it is. But in our animal studies, we did not have any safety concerns with the vaccines for mom or baby. And now we have a whole lot of data specific to pregnant women from our monitoring systems. And when they evaluated that data and broke it down, they found that there was no increased risk for miscarriage for women who received the messenger RNA vaccines either during their pregnancy or within the 28-day time frame before they became pregnant. And they also looked at completed pregnancies and did not find any increased risk of adverse outcomes for mom or baby. Some exciting news is we've also found antibodies in breast milk and the cord blood of the placenta, which is shared with the baby. And so we're hopeful, that hasn't been proven yet, but if it holds true like other vaccines, mom's antibodies are going to baby and will hopefully provide protection to the baby, because in all likelihood, the baby's not going to be able to get vaccinated till 6 months of age. And that's a few months down the road even. So we can potentially provide some protection to the baby from mom having been vaccinated. And then infertility. So there have been 2 major studies looking at infertility, one in men, one in women. And they looked at the sperm parameters in men before and after vaccination. And they looked at pregnancy success rates in women who were undergoing in vitro fertilization. And that's important because that sort of removes all the other factors that can impact pregnancy success rates, and found no difference in women before and after they received the COVID vaccine. So to answer your question specifically, initially there were 2 myths. One was that the spike protein that the vaccine teaches our body to form antibodies against, the theory was that there's a similar protein that's important for the embryo to be able to implant into the uterus. And that if we taught our body how to destroy the spike protein, it would destroy that protein too. Now, that's since been, what did I just do? That's since been completely debunked. The similarities in those 2 proteins are less than 0.001%, or something like that. They're not that similar. The other concern was actually an individual that misinterpreted one of the animal studies, and he was saying that there were all these nanoparticles that built up in the ovaries of the animals, and that was his theory, that the vaccine would cause infertility by this buildup in the ovaries. He's since come back and he misinterpreted the study, but that stuff gets out on social media and it just goes viral, and it's hard to pull it back. But both of those theories have since been completely debunked. What we do know for fact is that women that are pregnant that get COVID do worse than women that are not pregnant and get COVID of the same age range. They are more likely to be in the hospital, to be in the ICU, to have to be on a ventilator, and to die. And they are more likely to have a preterm delivery. So when you look at those risk benefits, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine, and American Society of Reproductive Medicine have all come out and said all women should be vaccinated, including pregnant women, including women who are planning to become pregnant. So that's a big consensus statement from some pretty big national organizations. And the last thing I hear all the time is, but I've already had COVID. Why do I need to have a COVID vaccine if I've already had COVID? Well, and just to be transparent, there's a whole lot about our natural immunity to COVID that we are still learning. So this could change. But what we know right now is that the immunity that you have after having an infection from COVID is variable from individual to individual. And it varies in the degree of protection it provides you. So it may reduce my risk of reinfection by half, but Sam's risk of reinfection by only 20%. So, it's different per different individual. The sort of scope of protection that it provides you is different. If I got COVID in December of last year, I may not be protected from the Delta variant because I formed antibodies against the Alpha variant. And so the scope of protection is variable. And then how long it lasts, we don't know. There's studies that show 2 months, 6 months, 9 months. In all reality, that's probably variable by individual as well. So vaccine-induced immunity is standardized. Everybody gets the same dose. We are studying it. We know how long it lasts. We know how well it works. And so that's why if you've had COVID, you should get vaccinated. Also, there's some newer data that's pretty exciting. That's if you have had COVID and you're vaccinated, you develop what's called hybrid immunity, which is better than having had COVID alone or having been vaccinated alone. They're calling it superhuman immunity. And so those people have the highest degree of protection of anyone. So yes, if you've had COVID, you should still go on and get vaccinated. And then real quick, just an update on vaccine boosters. I've heard several people in here have already been boosted, which is wonderful. But if you're 65 or older, you live in a long-term care facility, you should get a booster. If you're 50 to 64 and you have underlying medical conditions, you should have a booster. So those underlying medical conditions are diabetes, being overweight or obese, having chronic liver, lung, kidney, or heart disease, pregnancy, they put pregnancy in there, having cancer or a decreased immune system. And then they added a couple of groups that are eligible for the booster vaccine. They may receive the booster vaccine. So if you're in that 18 to 49 year group, but you have underlying medical conditions, or if you're 18 to 64 and you work or live in a setting that puts you at increased risk of exposure and then potentially subsequent infection and transmission, you are eligible. And that, of course, includes healthcare workers, teachers. I think they added in folks that work in homeless shelters and jails. And then that dose is 6 months after your second dose. This applies to the Pfizer vaccine only. Moderna and Johnson & Johnson have applied for the booster authorization from the FDA, but have not gotten it yet. So the vaccine booster is for Pfizer only. If you got Moderna or Johnson & Johnson, you need to hold on just a little bit. And that's all I've got. If you guys have any questions, that's a whole lot of information.
Any questions?
John Carmack, I just had a question about a study released today about accidental intravenous injection of a vaccine instead of intramuscular and what that could have caused side effects wise. Some of these side effects we've been hearing about might have been caused by improper injection instead of anything wrong with the vaccines.
So I heard about that yesterday and I haven't had a chance to read through it. So I can't comment intelligently on that, but I do know that there was some concern about the potential of IV administration versus IM. But yeah, I haven't read on exactly what that meant as far as outcomes.
Dr. Holder, for the people at Zoom, I'm Brian Riga. I have had the full complement of vaccines, and I still can't get silverware or my keys to stick to me.
Did you get the non-magnetized version?
Am I doing something wrong, or did Leanne give me saline?
No, there has been a whole lot of hubbub about them being having some metal or being magnetized in some way. In general, there is no metal in the vaccine. However, there was I think it was either in Spain and the drug was manufactured in Japan, or it was in Japan and the drug was manufactured in Spain. There was a lot of about 500,000 doses that somehow in the manufacturing process, they did end up with little shards of metal in the vaccine. None of that made its way to the US. They were distributed, they were given to people, and they followed those people, and they're fine. No one is magnetized. But yes, the rest of the vaccines, there's no magnets, there's no metal, there's no microchips.
John Deacon here. So with the resistance to taking the vaccine, getting the vaccine, so what is the long-term prospects for COVID hanging around, and what do those of us who want a vaccine, how often are we going to have it every year like a flu vaccine, or what are the long-term prospects for COVID?
So I don't think we know that exactly yet, but I would guess yes. That's the general thought, is that COVID will become endemic like the flu. And because it's a virus, it's going to mutate. And so we're going to need different vaccines on some sort of regular basis. I don't think we know what that is yet. What's really worrisome is viruses can only mutate if they can spread. And so the longer we go with this widespread transmission, we're putting ourselves, our community, at risk of, we now are dealing with a variant that's more infectious, it's more severe than Delta, or maybe it's able to evade our immune response. So having had COVID before or having been vaccinated won't protect you. I certainly don't want that to happen. The second thing is, the more infectious a virus is, the higher the degree of immunity you have to reach herd immunity. You've all heard herd immunity. So if the more infectious a virus is, the more people we have to have immune to reach that herd immunity. And so with the Delta variant, that number has gone from 60 to 65 to 80 to 85. I've heard 90%. So it just gets harder and harder and harder to get where we need to be the longer it takes us to get there.
Dr. Holder, Gregory Hansen on Zoom via chat says, how likely is it that some of the reported decline in new cases is linked to people taking home tests and not reporting the results?
I thought about that yesterday. Actually, I was listening to Dr. Spite's presentation he does for us on Mondays. I mean, I think it's contributing, but I think it's been contributing a long time. So I don't think I don't think it is why we're seeing that decrease. We've had those home tests available for a long time now. So, but I definitely think we are missing out on cases because people are testing at home or not testing, unfortunately. But I don't think it's the result. I don't think it's the cause of the decline.
Any other questions? Thank you, Dr. Holder.
Yeah, no problem.
Dr. Holder, thank you for your presentation. It was excellent, very informative. Next meeting is next Tuesday, October the 12th. Our program will be Mental Health by Matt Knight. And the thought for the day, in a gentle way, you can shake the world. That was from Mahatma Gandhi. Hope y'all have a great week. Enjoy the weather.